The week of mystery mostly concluded on Friday afternoon, with authorities announcing they have made an arrest in the case of who's been sending around defective sort of bombs to high-profile Democratic figures across the country. His name is Cesar Sayoc, a 56-year-old Native American man arrested in Plantation, Florida. The FBI says they have fingerprint and DNA evidence connecting him to the bomb packages, and he's now being charged with multiple federal crimes, facing up to 58 years in prison. And yeah, as many have observed, there are a lot of oddities in this case. He was caught in some sort of cartoonish pro-Trump MAGA van that looks like it probably contains a lot more secrets than just what exactly happened in this particular case. The bombs he was sending around never actually detonated and presumably were never intended to detonate, given their obvious design defects. He's apparently very pro-Trump and somehow thinks he's helping the president's political cause by committing acts of terrorism less than 2 weeks before a crucial midterm election. The list goes on. I get it, it's odd. But I'm not diving down the conspiracy rabbit hole. I'm not dusting off my tinfoil hat. I'm comfortable explaining the lack of coherent logic in this case with the simple fact that this guy is almost certainly wildly illogical. His prior criminal record is extensive. He was arrested for theft several times in the 90s. He was convicted in 2002 on a felony charge of threatening to throw or place a bomb. In 2004, he was convicted for possession of illegal steroids, battery in 2013, grand theft and misdemeanor theft in 2014, he filed for bankruptcy as well in 2012. And if all that's not criminal enough, it looks like he drew on his hair with a Sharpie. Either that or it's the tightest ponytail ever pulled. This probably isn't a guy of sound mind. Based on the available evidence, that's the most plausible explanation to me. In any case, there are lessons to remember here, whether this is what it appears to be or some grand false flag orchestrated by the globalist elite. They're lessons of who bears responsibility for violence when it happens, and the degree to which we're going to hold mere speech associated with that violence accountable. Before the facts were available, even now, not everything is fully known or understood, but even before we had any information on the suspect in this case, media figures were rushing to assign blame and responsibility for this incident. I'll spare you the suspense of who is apparently to blame, though that, of course, is no surprise. There are some specific examples I want to discuss in a moment. But first, consider why we have an established standard of a strict separation between words and violence in this country. The Supreme Court's precedent since 1969 is the First Amendment protects everything up to speech inciting imminent violence, and that violence being likely to happen. In other words, unless you're implementing a credible plot, you're within the scope of free speech. You're not behaving violently. But that's just the legal standard. Yeah, that ought to be the cultural standard too. Otherwise, you make civil politics with opposition much more difficult, if not impossible. If you consider my opinion tantamount to violence, suddenly violence becomes a justified reaction to my opinion, and we have a much messier situation. Speech is speech, violence is violence, and conflating the two results in more violence, not less. That is the philosophy behind our standard in this country, at least for now. But this week I saw plenty of media examples that would erode that standard and that philosophy, connecting the president to this incident based on loose rhetorical and ideological agreement rather than actual incitement to violence. A CNN segment ran with a title that reads, "Manhunt for Serial Bomber Going After Trump's Targets." The implication being that because the president disagrees with these people politically, he has some sort of responsibility for the attack on them.
The one common thread between all of these bombs, all of those who are being targeted, are President Trump's frequent punching bags.
On MSNBC, former Hillary advisor Philippe Reines said the attacker has weaponized Trump's Twitter feed.
This is someone who has weaponized Trump's Twitter feed and made it into a hit list. While he might think that he's just putting on good TV, all you need is one person who doesn't realize that, and one person who thinks it's okay to do this.
Paul Waldman writes in the Washington Post opinion pages, quote, "Trump paints for his supporters an apocalyptic picture of the horrors Democrats want to bring to the United States, presenting the most horrific fantasies as fact. If you thought that Democrats want to force the entire country to starve and then allow MS-13 gang members to come to your community so that they can kill you and your family, which, because we have to keep repeating this, is literally what Trump says, then why wouldn't you feel that any possible means, including including violence, should be employed to stop them. It's only self-defense. Consider in the abstract what sort of speech this standard would implicate. If you publicly disagree with someone politically, and that person is targeted with political violence, you're culpable. If you speak about politics in exaggerated or hyperbolic terms and political violence happens, you're culpable. And if political violence happens one time, even one time, that is reason enough for all of us to self-censor and to censor each other. At that point, what's left? Polite agreement? And only if it adheres strictly to the facts? That doesn't just sound politically unhealthy. That sounds incredibly boring. But if you're not persuaded by the abstract, consider how these standards would apply to past cases of political violence in the opposite ideological direction. Consider the 2017 congressional baseball shooter who nearly killed several Republican members of Congress. He was a volunteer for Bernie Sanders' presidential run. He inflicted violence upon Bernie's quote-unquote targets. He weaponized Bernie's Twitter feed, a Twitter feed that to this day continues to make hyperbolic claims about how people will die if the policies of his political opposition are implemented. If Trump warning of MS-13 gang murders is responsible for violent self-defense, then so is Bernie warning of corporate greed killing your grandma. Or how about the 2016 killing of Dallas police officers by Micah Johnson, a man who professed support for Black Lives Matter during the incident? Under this standard, he was going after Obama's targets. The former president was a supporter of that movement, and just days before that specific incident, he had spoken on exaggerated terms about supposed systemic racism in the justice system.
There are biases, some conscious and unconscious, that have to be rooted out. When people say Black Lives Matter, that doesn't mean blue lives don't matter. It just means all lives matter. But right now, the big concern is the fact that the data shows black folks are more vulnerable to these kinds of incidents.
If Trump warning about open borders naturally leads to violence, why doesn't Obama warning about racist cops targeting you with shootings do the same thing? To be clear, that is not to say we should condemn or crack down on Obama or Bernie or Trump. That is to say that any standard we set ought to be considered and applied to our political friends and foes alike. Sure, you may not like Trump's policy plans. You may not like his rhetorical style, but assigning him responsibility for violence, saying he ought not to advocate what he believes on his usual exaggerated terms, that standard also means Barack Obama ought not to criticize America's police forces on harsh terms. That standard also means Bernie Sanders ought not to advocate for socialized health care on dire terms. That standard will apply a constraint to our politics that will dull the vibrancy of our debate to a point that it lacks purpose. That's why my answer is to protect impassioned adversarial speech as much as we can, regardless of whether I agree with it or not, because impassioned adversarial speech is a sign of health in a free society, not a sign of decay. It is inherent to the freedom whereby you get to say what you believe to be true, even if you take some rhetorical liberties in expressing yourself, and I get to respond in kind. That is a vital sign, not a disease symptom. That's why we have to protect impassioned adversarial political speech as much as possible, and only punish political violence when it's actually violence. Let's prosecute this guy for making and sending bombs. Let's appreciate the fact that nobody was hurt or killed in this incident, and let's not make our commitment to speech this case's only casualty. Because if you surrender speech as a means to reduce violence, the unfortunate reality is you actually get neither. The freedom to oppose ideas with counter-ideas on passionate, even ridiculous terms is the alternative to violence. It is the option that releases our passions without actually harming one another. If we erode that option, if we constrict that alternative, it doesn't lead to peace. It leads to the same heated rivalries, just on much less desirable terms. Let's not take that path. Thanks as always for listening and for supporting this channel always. Appreciate that thoughtful discussion down below, and especially over on Twitter, that is at ML Christiansen. You're always welcome to coming out and chat in my live streams. Those are linked down in the description. Looking forward to it. Okay, bye.